So Matt, we are back to the field now to speak about the Middle Bronze Age. And we picked up a wonderful location because people behind us are working. We are in real time. This is the Middle Bronze Age. And I'll tell you a secret which you know very well. We are sitting now on top of the city wall, brick city wall of the Middle Bronze Age. But before going to details, I wish to say a few words to connect to what we said before in this series on Megiddo. We spoke after the introduction about the 3rd millennium BC, about the first wave of urbanism in the early Bronze, and then and monumentality also, possibly first city-states, then about the crisis in the second half of the 3rd millennium BC, between 2500 and 2000 BC. There was some sort of a crisis, no urban culture in the entire region of the southern Levant. And now we are sitting here in order to discuss the re-emergence of urban life in Canaan. And in fact, we open now 2 talks, one on the Middle Bronze and one on the Late Bronze, which cover the continuity in the Late Bronze Age also. Because from the Middle Bronze to the Late Bronze until the collapse of urban life in the crisis here, about 1,000 years later, from the beginning, this is one chunk in the history of Canaan. And I think that when we speak about the Middle Bronze, we need to remember several facts. First of all, that we are definitely here into a scene of city-states, and we can really identify the important in the valley city-states next to Megiddo, Shimron, for instance, a little bit to the north of us, as an example. This is the first thing. And the second item, when we zoom out a little bit, this is the first period when we have records on Canaan, written records. Several of them, the most well-known perhaps the execration text from Egypt, which come from the Middle Bronze Age, from the early phases of the Middle Bronze Age. So having said that, I'm turning to you, Matt, and I'm asking you, tell us a little bit about Megiddo in the Middle Bronze Age, some sort of a background.
Sure. Megiddo in the Middle Bronze Age is not unlike the Megiddo in the Early Bronze Age in the sense that it's fabulous. It's huge. What really characterizes this period in terms of the monuments that have been excavated are huge fortifications, big city gates, multiple fortification walls, really dense accumulation of habitation remains over a long period of time. And one of the main phenomena that we have excavated are burials. In this point in time, burials of your family members under the floor of your house becomes common tradition. And so we know a lot about dead people during this particular period.
And they tell us a lot. When you investigate dead people, you can really, from them, learn a lot about the society. And we'll speak about it in a minute. But before we do this, I wish to ask you the following question. When, in your opinion, was Megiddo fortified for the first time in the Middle Bronze Age?
I'm glad you asked, because that's one of the things that we've been wrestling with of late. In Area S, which is on the other side of the tell from where we are now, that is the main entrance to the site itself, the city gates. It's really difficult to give a pinpoint answer right now, but we're getting closer and closer. And the answer is really surprising. It's very, very early in the Middle Bronze Age 1 period, somewhere not long after 2000 BC, based on the radiocarbon dates that we put together so far.
So this would be one of the first places in Canaan to be fortified when urbanism comes back. So in the very beginning of the 20th century. So this is a bit before, the conventional wisdom about the beginning of the fortifications. And so this is a kind of surprise.
Yeah, I would say it's almost earth-shattering, because I think the normal narrative for this period is somewhere in the middle of the 20th century, say 1950, people start to come back to these sites. They build small villages, small communities, which grow in complexity and then build fortifications some generations later. But here it really looks like Megiddo, bam, becomes an urban center again in a very, very short time.
And there is difference, I want to ask you about it. There is difference between the two main areas where we are operating. We are here in Area K. This is the southeastern sector of Megiddo, but we are working also in the northwestern sector. And the picture is not the same. right?
Yeah, it's much more complicated on the other side, and there's some good reasons for that. First of all, we're at the back of the city, so to speak, now, and as far as we know, Megiddo only had one entrance, and that was on the north side. So we're very much on the south side, as far away from that as possible. And here, the story is not uncomplicated either. It's a couple of large city walls, maybe even a third earlier one that we're just coming up today, ringing the city. And it's sort of straightforward. We have a big city wall, they rebuild it or they expand it and so forth. In Area S, where the gates are, it's far more complicated. We see at least 5 major monumental rebuildings of the entrance to the city.
I mean, I have never seen anything like that in my career.
That's right. Just in the first, say, century of the Middle Bronze Age. It's nuts.
And I would like to mention that also the preservation is unique here. Quite surprising. We are sitting now on top of the Middle Bronze Age fortification. I mean, we are sitting on top of a brick wall, 5 meters thick, and very impressive one. On this side behind me, the city wall still stands now something like 4 meters high, and 1 meter is missing, so like 5 meters high. Preservation 4,000 years later, bricks.
That's right.
Which is really, I mean, I'm kind of surprised is a small word to describe what I feel when I look at this preservation of the fortification.
But what are they for? I mean, I know we call them fortifications, but it just seems like overkill.
Yes, this is something which has bothered me for many years. You know, I excavated many years ago at Shiloh, which is a smaller site than Megiddo, and a little bit later in the Middle Bronze, but still monumental to the extent that you ask questions. You know, what is this for? Who were the people who did this and why? We have to admit that we don't really have the full answer, because we are in a period where we already have records, but not really descriptions, that can shed light on complex questions like this. But I would say the following. First of all, we need to assume that the country was divided into city-states. And they were fighting over fertile land, over water, over pasture land and things like this, over, what is the last village from here paying tax to this king, and what is the first village over there on the horizon paying tax to another king. So probably there was animosity between the city-states, and they were protecting themselves against possible attacks by, a nearby city-state. I don't see a big enemy from the outside, like, Middle Kingdom Egypt attacking, with military. Not on an ongoing way. Maybe a single event could have happened, but this was not the reason. The second thing that we need to bear in mind, which does not confirm with the way, or maybe yes, people think today, there's a lot of prestige in this. Think about the situation. There's this petty king of Megiddo, and there's this petty king of Shimron, not so far from here, maybe 20 kilometers away, and they basically hate each other. And they are envy of each other. And each one wants to boast and say, well, I'm stronger, I'm more important. So they express their importance by this monumentality, by this prestige. I can construct bigger fortifications than you. I can build bigger palaces. I can give a better temple to the god. Whatever god was worshipped then. So there is also this thing of prestige involved with the daily practice of life. The two of them need to be considered.
It's interesting, to think of these in both of these terms. What's really strange about Megiddo is how much the city built up inside these walls.
Unbelievable. Right?
It's like they put this wall around the city and it became a donut that the city just built up into, and within 100 years, the houses are being built on top of the city wall.
We are not used to this, and even when we travel to Europe today and we go to visit, a cathedral from the 12th century BC. So we are 800 years or more later, and there is a difference of maybe a meter and a half.
Yeah.
And here you look at Megiddo, and I am really stunned when I look at the evidence, because here behind us there is an accumulation, I think we both agree, of about perhaps 5 meters of layers. And I think I counted something like 7 or 9, I'm not going to start counting again, layers, strata, one on top of the other, in a period of time which is relatively limited. We are speaking only about the first half of the second millennium BC, which means the Middle Bronze starts probably around 2000 BC, perhaps a little bit later, a few years later, and continues until supposedly the middle of the 16th century, which means 1550. And when we say Middle Bronze, Late Bronze, you know, the viewers need to understand that we are speaking about material culture basically, and shape of pottery and so on. So this period is what, 450 years, and the city goes up 5 meters, you know, with 9 layers. So there was a lot of waste. There were many changes. Everything was built of bricks. Every time they wanted to renovate, they had to destroy the walls. So they pushed the bricks, they leveled everything, and they built again. And the city came up and up and up, you know, 5 meters.
Halfway through this period, there were no fortifications per se. There was a cliff edge that was outside of the wall, but there were people living on top. The city was spilling over the top of it. It must have looked ridiculous.
So, Matt, we have spoken about the simple people living here in the backwater of the site, far from the gate and from the main sector of the elite. But we are speaking about a city-state, so there must have been a temple here. There was a temple here, and the palace. So tell me a little bit about the monuments of Megiddo.
Yeah, there are many monuments from the Middle Bronze Age here, particularly outside of the city gate and the main monumental entrance itself. The eastern side of the site, which was the ancient holy place. We talked about it in the early Bronze Age.
Right.
They continued to find this area sacred, and they continued to build temples there. In particular, not too late into the Middle Bronze Age, they already constructed some sort of huge monumental tower temples, what we call them, because it has the facade as 2 big towers sticking out from the main sanctuary. This was really impressive structure that continued on in use all the way into the Iron Age almost. And it's big, almost totally excavated by the University of Chicago, so we haven't been able to check it ourselves, but it's very clearly starts in the Middle Bronze Age.
And it had been removed by them.
Completely removed. Right next to this temple was a large palace. In fact, it kind of feels like the palace itself was encompassing the temple itself, like a sacred compound. So you kind of get the sense that royalty is somehow controlling the temple area itself. The palace is not shabby either. Just like this area, they rebuilt the palace at least 3 times before it moved to a different area at the very end of the Middle Bronze Age and got enlarged there as well.
So this takes me to the question of demography, and I suppose that first of all people would be interested to learn how many people lived in a place like this.
That's the big question everybody asks.
It's a big question because, you know, we're speaking about monumental architecture, and you have just described to me a huge temple at Megiddo and the palace. You know, how many people were here to build all this? So we need to tell the viewers that we are dealing with a site which could have been, you know, in the Middle Bronze Age, together with the lower tell, perhaps 110 or 20 dunams, which means 12 hectares altogether. And if we calculate according to pre-modern societies, information, ethnographic formation on pre-modern societies, we can multiply by 200 per hectare. So if we are dealing with 10 hectares, perhaps 2,000 people, something like that. That's all. We are not speaking about a huge city, right? Yeah. But there were the villages in the valley in front of us, and there were many of them, we know from the surveys. So we are speaking in the moment that we have city-states, there's the hub of the king and the palace and the temple and the people in the countryside, and they pay tribute and they pay tax and so on. So when they have to put them to work in order to construct a fortification like this, they can, as long as they can provide them with food, which means organized production, agricultural production, they can put them to work in the hub at the central site of Megiddo.
You mentioned early on that burials tell us a lot about the population. Any burials from the Middle Bronze Age that can help us here?
So yes, so this is really fascinating. Now we are turning, in the introduction conversation we spoke about it, that we are trying to make Megiddo, you know, a site where we test modern methods and techniques, and indeed in the Middle Bronze we can see this very clearly. So much of what we are doing regarding modern technologies and modern methods is related to the burials at Megiddo.
Okay.
So in the area behind us, there are many burials from the Middle Bronze Age. I'm speaking here about the beginning of the second millennium, of course. At that time, they buried, I think you mentioned it before in your words, that they buried their dead under the floors of the houses. And when we come across a burial like this, we work very carefully. And we carried out here two investigations which are really interesting to see things beyond the naked eye. I suppose to speak about microarchaeology, what we cannot see with the naked eye, but we see under a microscope,
right,
so to speak. So the first one, there is this royal tomb, I mean elite tomb, that the two of us excavated 6 years ago in another area of the Tel. And you remember that there were juglets in the tomb. There was gold and silver and what else, I mean, you name it. Really elaborate. And there were several people interred in the tomb. It's a stone structure, chamber, underground chamber, a very beautiful one, constructed also. And we took there were offerings, including small juglets, and we wondered what was offered in the small juglets. And today it is possible to do a study of molecular residues in containers, including ceramic containers. And we did that. Vanessa Linares led PhD student, led the work in that of the juglets at that tomb, and we were surprised to discover that they included vanilla. The content was also, I mean, including vanilla. Now, vanilla, where did it come from?
Some exotic something.
Exotic, where did it come from? So, you know, today vanilla is brought from Mexico, for instance, but we do not speak about, you know, maritime connections between the ancient Near East and America in the middle of the second millennium. So apparently the vanilla came from the Far East, from perhaps the Malabar coast in India. So
Amazing.
This is an indication that the tomb is dated 1600 BC. And this is an indication that around 1600 BC, there were already contacts, not maybe necessarily one person walking, you know, from the Malabar coast with a juglet, you know, to Megiddo, but, you know, with stations on the way to bring commodities from there, exotic commodities to the Levant. The second investigation is even more groundbreaking, I think, than this. This is the place where we conducted the first intensive ancient DNA project in Israel. I mean, especially for the Bronze and Iron Ages. So there are many samples here that were sent. I mean, when we speak about an investigation like this, it's not being done by me or by you. You cannot extract DNA, and I cannot do the mathematics of the mathematic manipulation. But the extraction was done at Harvard in the US by David Reich and his lab. The bioinformatics, which means the mathematic manipulation of the results, was done at the Hebrew U by Lilia Granat, Liran Carmel, and their team. And the result was very interesting. We discovered here that the population of second millennium Megiddo, and not one of them, all of them, the population of second millennium Megiddo, their genetic pool was composed of two components. The first one is what we described as Neolithic Levant, which means the population of the Levant running down from Neolithic times.
Okay.
And the second, most surprising, there is evidence for migration of people from the northeastern sector of the ancient Near East. In today's words, Caucasus, Eastern Turkey, Armenia, Georgia, northeastern Iran, this area of the ancient Near East, and we see them from the third millennium into the second millennium. Here we see them in the second millennium, and there are indications for these people also in the material culture of Canaan, and also in the record of names of petty kings of the late Bronze Age, somewhat later, because the name of the king of Megiddo, which you described to us in the opening clip, Biridia, this is not, he does not carry a Semitic name, but rather a Hurite name from the far northeastern part of the ancient Near East. So this is really very, very interesting. We know a lot now about the population. Not only that, we can do a trick here because we work also with physical anthropologists. So we know about the age of death of these individuals, and we know about their sex, gender, male, female, and we know where they are. So now also we impose on this what we know from the DNA, first relation, second relation, and in fact, when you come to think of it, we can reconstruct the entire quarter of Megiddo and the relationship between the people in the Middle Bronze Age, let's say around 1700, 1600 BC.
Wow, amazing.
If somebody told me this 20 years ago, I would not have believed.
The Middle Bronze Age takes us through to the middle of the second millennium, and we typically talk about the Middle Bronze followed by the Late Bronze Age. And these are archaeological terms that we use, of course, but they're sort of imposed on us from an historian's point of view. We have no major changes that we can see physically in the transition from the Middle Bronze to the Late Bronze Age.
Yes, here at Megiddo, not even a destruction.
That's right. But we know from historical sources that things do change, and they change big. We see the arrival of Egypt on the scene and the change in the dynamic relationships between local city-states and their imperial overlords. So next time...
Exactly. This is the topic of our next conversation.
Great.
Thank you, Matt.
All right.